folding crushed crackers into canned salmon by feel, pulling pork chop drippings into gravy with nothing but cold water and a spoon, stretching one bell pepper across 5 plates. She knew what she was doing, and none of it got written down. Here are 30 easy suppers 60s black moms made without a recipe. Salmon patties showed up at least once a week in most African American households through the 1960s, and the way she made them had nothing to do with the recipe card. A tall can of pink salmon got emptied into a bowl, bones included. The liquid drained, but set aside to pour over rice later. Crackers went in next, not breadcrumbs, crushed between her palms, right over the bowl, along with a beaten egg, diced onion, a spoon of mustard, black pepper, and salt. The mix got shaped into thick rounds and pressed firm so they'd hold together in the grease. Cast iron got hot, not warm, hot, before the first patty went in. You could hear the difference between a skillet that was ready and one that wasn't. She knew by the sound. They fried golden and crackling on the outside, tender all the way through. Nobody who grew up eating them can explain what she did differently. They just know nobody else gets it right. Smothered chicken and rice was the supper that could silence a table full of hungry people in 30 seconds. She'd cut the chicken herself, season every surface hard with salt, black pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, dredge each piece in flour, and set it in hot lard until the skin turned a deep, crackling gold. When the chicken came out, every brown bit and rendered drop of fat stayed in the skillet. Sliced onions went in, stirred and scraped until they softened and picked up all that color from the bottom of the pan. Water went in next, the flour from the dredging thickening it as it simmered. And then the chicken went back in with the lid on low for 45 minutes until the meat had pulled from the bone and the gravy had gone deep brown and rich. Over long grain white rice, it was a supper that cost almost nothing and tasted like it cost everything. The last person who made it exactly right has been gone a long time. That gravy has never been quite the same since, no matter how many times someone tries. Stewed tomatoes over white rice sounds too simple to be a supper, and in a lot of 1960s households, it showed up when the week had gone tight, but that framing misses what she actually did to it. The tomatoes went into a saucepan with a generous spoon of butter and a pinch of sugar, the move nobody outside these kitchens knew about. The sugar cut the acid without making it sweet, and the butter rounded out the sharpness of the can. She let it reduce for 15 or 20 minutes until it thickened into something closer to a sauce. The rice was already done. She plated first and ladled the tomatoes over the top. Hot, enough that steam rose off the bowl. 3 ingredients, less than 15 minutes. Everything came down to 2 small details she never wrote down, and neither did anyone else. Fried pork chops with pan drippings. Gravy was built entirely on technique, and the technique lived in her hands. Blade cut chops, the thin, bony ones that cost next to nothing, got seasoned hard, pressed into flour until coated white, then laid into hot lard with a sharp cracking hiss that meant the temperature was right. She'd cook them through until the crust was deep brown, then set them aside on a plate. Every bit of brown flour, rendered fat, and caramelized seasoning stuck to that cast iron was the foundation of what came next. Cold water went in, not broth, just water, and she'd work the bottom with a wooden spoon until everything loosened and rose up into the liquid, the heat pulling it all into a gravy that thickened on its own with no roux, no extra flour, just what the chops had left behind. If you had to ask how much water, you weren't ready to make it. She is gone now. That specific ratio of drippings to water, the one that made it taste like nothing else, left with her, and it has not come back. Before any of that meat hit the pan, there were the nights when the week had stretched thin and the pantry was down to the basics. Liver and onions with skillet gravy was the supper African-American mothers in the 1960s either loved to cook or simply had to, because beef liver was among the cheapest cuts at any butcher through that decade, sometimes less than 20 cents a pound. The trick was in the onions, and the trick was time. Sliced thin, they went into lard or bacon grease over medium-low and stayed there for 20 minutes until they turned the color of old honey and gone completely soft and sweet. The liver came next, sliced a half-inch thick, dusted in flour and salt, 3 minutes aside, no more, because overcooked liver turns grainy and bitter and forfeits everything. She knew this without being told. The pan got deglazed with a little water, the onions stirred back in, the gravy dark and thick. It divided the table every time. The people who grew up eating it still crave it. Everyone else missed out and never knew it. The Pinto bean pot was a Monday institution in African American households because Monday was wash day, the day the laundry needed tending from morning to dusk, and nothing on the stove could require constant attention. Dried pintos, soaked overnight, went into the pot first thing with a block of fatback rinsed to knock off some of the salt. The fatback rendered down over hours, its fat releasing slowly into the bean water and turning the whole pot silky in a way no seasoning packet could replicate. She'd set it on the back burner at the lowest heat and leave it alone until late afternoon, adding water once or twice when the level dropped. By supper time, the beans had absorbed everything the fatback had given, the potlikker had gone thick and starchy, and the whole house smelled of something deep and slow and patient. Cornbread went into the cast iron around 4:30. Supper was on the table by 5, and nobody had to ask what was for dinner because they'd been smelling it since 9 in the morning. The Monday bean pot didn't need a recipe. It needed a whole day and the kind of patience that doesn't pass down easily anymore. Turkey wings braised with onions and celery was the supper that proved she could take almost any cut and pull something worth remembering from it. Turkey wings became a regular in African American kitchens through the 1960s as national production expanded following the post-war years. They were meaty, inexpensive, and far more forgiving than chicken. She'd season them hard, dust them in flour, and brown them in a Dutch oven until the skin was deep gold. In went rough-cut onions and celery, leaves included, never discarded, along with enough water to come halfway up the wings, a bay leaf, and black pepper. The lid went on low for an hour and a half, sometimes 2, until the meat had loosened from the joint and the broth had gone glossy with collagen. Some nights potatoes went in during the last half hour. Some nights it was just wings and broth poured over rice. Either way, what came out of that pot was more than anyone expected from a cut that used to be the part everyone passed over. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and ground beef were how she turned a 1/4 pound of meat into supper for 5 people without anyone at the table noticing the math. Green peppers got their tops cut off and seeds scooped out, then stood upright in a baking dish like cups waiting to be filled. The filling was where the calculation lived: ground beef browned with diced onion, then mixed with cooked white rice at a ratio that he tilted hard toward the rice, sometimes 2 cups to every half cup of meat, stretched further with tomato sauce stirred through. She'd taste it, adjust the salt, add garlic powder and black pepper, then pack each pepper until the filling mounded above the rim. A spoonful of sauce went over the top of each one before the dish went uncovered into a 350-degree oven where it stayed until the peppers softened and the tops browned slightly. The finished dish looked like abundance, a full pepper per person, steaming, smelling of tomato and browned meat. Nobody could tell how far the meat had been stretched. She never told. You never asked. That was the agreement in those kitchens. Stewed okra and tomatoes over cornbread carried its history in every bite, though nobody at the table was thinking about history when the bowls came out. Okra traveled to the American South through West African foodways and the gullet tradition of stewing it long with tomatoes until it released its natural thickening, turned a simple vegetable into its own sauce. She'd slice the okra into rounds and fry it briefly in bacon grease before the tomatoes went in. That step cut the sliminess that put people off, a detail she knew and most outsiders didn't. Canned tomatoes, salt, black pepper, onion, sometimes a pinch of sugar if they tasted sharp, simmered until the okra had fully softened and the whole thing had body. The cornbread, already baked in the cast iron, got broken into the bottom of each bowl, and the stew ladled hot over the top, soaking in and becoming part of the dish. It was a meatless supper that nobody called meatless. It was just Tuesday. And if the okra pot was the supper built from what the garden gave up, the navy bean soup was the supper built from what the pantry held steady. Dried navy beans went in after an overnight soak, brought to a boil, and dropped to the lowest simmer the gas burner could manage. Smoked turkey next went in early, not as garnish, but as the whole foundation of flavor. And over 4 or 5 hours, they released their smoke and collagen and deep savory fat until the broth had transformed into something else entirely. By late afternoon, the beans had softened and begun to break apart at the edges, thickening the liquid from the inside. The pot turned a deep, cloudy tan that meant it was nearly ready. She'd taste it, adjust the salt, maybe add another pinch of black pepper. Bowls came out with cornbread on the side and a splash of hot sauce if you wanted it. There was no recipe for this soup. There was a turkey neck, a bag of beans, a pot, and a woman who made it enough times to know it was done by the color of the broth and the way the kitchen smelled after the 3rd hour. Salt pork and white beans drew a line between people who grew up eating it and people who didn't, because salt pork and fatback might look similar at the butcher counter, but they weren't the same, and she knew the difference. Salt pork was dry rubbed and cured longer, denser and more intensely flavored, with actual meat running through it alongside the fat. She'd cut it into thick slabs and render it in the pot first, letting the fat melt out slowly before the soaked Great Northern beans went in. That rendered fat became the cooking medium and the flavor base at once, giving the finished pot a richness different from ham hock, more concentrated, slightly harder. The beans needed nothing beyond salt, pepper, and thyme, and the dish was ready when the broth had gone thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. A splash of cider vinegar over the top at the table cut through the fat and opened everything up. It was the one detail only someone who sat at the right table would know to tell you. She knew. She always knew. And now that table is gone. Ham steak with red-eye gravy was the supper that proved coffee belonged on the stove as much as in the cup. The technique ran through Southern black cooking, going back further than anyone at that table could trace. Built from the drippings of a cured ham steak and a pour of black coffee that created something unlike any gravy made with flour. She'd fried the ham steak in a dry cast iron skillet, a thick bone-in slice from a cured country ham, rinsed before it went in to cut some of the salt, until both sides had developed a deep mahogany crust. Then, without moving the pan, she'd pour in strong black coffee, the dark kind left from the morning pot, and let it hit the drippings all at once. The sizzle was sharp and violent and over in a second, and what remained began to reduce immediately, the coffee pulling everything from the bottom and turning it into a thin, dark, savory liquid with a bitterness that had no business tasting as good as it did. You poured it over the ham over rice, over a split biscuit. The name came from the round of fat that floated at the center, the red eye staring back up from the pan. Stuffed cabbage rolls with tomato sauce arrived in African American kitchens through the North, carried sideways into Black households in Chicago and Detroit after the Great Migration, where the technique traveled from Eastern European immigrant neighbors across back fences and church suppers. She blanched the whole cabbage head in boiling water until the outer leaves softened and peeled away clean, lay each leaf flat, and piled the center with a mix of ground beef, cooked rice, diced onion, salt, pepper, and a spoonful of tomato paste that held it all together. The leaf got folded in from the sides, rolled tight, set seam side down in a baking dish. Tomato sauce went over the top, the dish covered with foil and baked low and slow until the rolls had softened completely and the sauce had reduced into something thick and dark and deeply savory. It took the whole afternoon. The people who watched her make it never thought to write it down, and now the whole recipe is gone with the woman who knew it. Pig feet and potato stew turned something the butcher sold for almost nothing into a pot so gelatinous and rich it coated the inside of the bowl. She'd get the feet pickled, vinegar brined at the local meat market, kept in jars behind the counter alongside the souse and the salt pork, rinse them well, and set them to boil. That first boil got poured off and the pot refilled with fresh water, which was the step most people skipped and the reason most people's pig feet never tasted right. Onion, black pepper, a bay leaf, back on low heat for 2 hours until the skin had gone soft and the broth had turned thick and glossy from the collagen releasing out of the bone. Potatoes went in for the last 45 minutes, served with cornbread to sop the broth. Nobody makes it anymore. The pig feet are still at the counter. The woman who knew what to do with them is not. Time equals 1 second / greater than salmon, and potato casserole stops people cold when you mention it, not because it sounds bad, but because they haven't thought about it in 30 years, and the memory lands somewhere behind the sternum before they can stop it. Canned salmon layered into a greased baking dish with thinly sliced raw potatoes, a sauce made from evaporated milk, flour, butter, salt, and pepper poured over everything, and into the oven at 350 for about an hour until the potatoes were tender and the top had browned to something between cream and gold. The smell coming out of that oven was nothing like what you'd expect from a can of salmon. It smelled like supper. It smelled like Tuesday evenings in a specific kitchen, and you can still conjure it 20 years after she left, even though you haven't been able to make it taste the same since. Wieners and rice and tomato sauce was what supper looked like on the nights when the grocery money had run out 3 days before payday, and she was working with what was in the back of the refrigerator, and nobody at the table was going to say a word about it because the alternative was clear to everyone old enough to understand arithmetic. The Wieners, whatever brand was cheapest, sliced into coins about 1/4 inch thick, went into a skillet with a little oil until they got some color on the flat sides, which made the difference between a dish that tasted like something and one that tasted like nothing. Ketchup went in next, thinned with a little water, salt and pepper, sometimes onion if there was one, simmered together until it thickened slightly and the Wieners had absorbed some of the tomato. Over white rice. Every person who grew up eating this in the 1960s will swear their mother made it best, and they are all correct, and none of them will ever be able to fully explain why it tasted like that in that kitchen and not quite like that anywhere else. Sardines as. Friday night supper only made sense if you understood the full context, which most people outside these households did not. The Friday piece came partly from Catholic influence on Southern Black communities, particularly in Louisiana and coastal Georgia, and partly from the simple economics of a protein that cost almost nothing and kept indefinitely on a shelf. She'd open the flat tin, packed in mustard or hot sauce, never oil if she could help it because the mustard pack had more flavor, and lay the sardines out on crackers or white bread, add a shake of hot sauce, a squeeze of lemon if there was one, and that was supper. Some nights she'd mash them into a spread. Some nights they went on a plate with sliced tomato and raw onion alongside. What those sardines delivered, all that concentrated, oily, deeply savory protein for less than 15 cents a can, was more than anyone standing in a grocery store today looking at that tin on the bottom shelf would guess. It was a meal that required no apology. She never gave one. Dried lima beans with smoked sausage were a different creature entirely from the small green limas that came frozen in a bag, and if you confused them, you'd understand immediately why. Large dried limas, soaked overnight until they'd swelled and the skins had gone taut, then drained and rinsed, went into a pot with fresh water, brought to a boil and dropped to a steady simmer. Smoked sausage went in partway through, sliced into coins, giving up its smokiness and staining the pot a warm amber that meant the broth was building. By the time the limas were done, fully soft but holding their shape, the broth had gone thick and slightly cloudy and deeply flavored in the way that only long-cooked beans can manage. Salt and black pepper went in at the end, never the beginning, because salting the water from the start toughens the skins and keeps the beans from softening properly. She knew that. She knew 100 small things like that, and she is gone now, and most of those things went with her. Souse meat on white bread was the supper you either grew up knowing about or you didn't, and there was no middle ground. Souse, pressed, pickled pork made from the trimmed and cooked meat of a hog's head, set in its own gelatin with vinegar, black pepper, sage, and red pepper flakes, then chilled until it sliced clean, live behind the counter at local black-owned butcher shops through the 1950s and 60s, sold by the pound in white paper. It came home to the refrigerator and got sliced cold onto white bread with hot sauce and sometimes a thin ring of raw onion. No cooking, no heating, no fire, just the cold meat and the sharp vinegar hit of the pickling and the heat of the sauce. It required no stove and no time, which made it perfect for the nights when there was nothing left in anyone. The butcher shops that made it are almost all gone. The Souse went with them. But if Souse was the supper that needed no cooking at all, the Monday chicken soup was the supper built from everything Sunday had already given up. She'd roasted a whole chicken on Sunday, and by evening, nothing remained but the carcass, stripped nearly bare, the bones still holding their marrow and all the roasted flavor from the oven. Monday morning, that carcass went into a pot with cold water and whatever vegetables were on hand, onion, celery, carrot if there was one, brought to a boil, then dropped to a simmer for 2 or 3 hours until the broth had pulled every bit of flavor from the bones and the kitchen had filled with that low, patient smell that meant something good was happening. The carcass came out, any remaining meat picked off and returned to the pot. Egg noodles or rice went in for the last 20 minutes. Salt, pepper, done. The cost of that soup was essentially nothing, made from what had already been eaten. Nobody wasted anything in those kitchens, and nobody who ate that soup on a cold Monday evening ever forgot exactly how it tasted. Pork and drop dumplings was the kind of supper most people, if they knew it at all, knew only as chicken and dumplings. But in African American households through the 1940s and 50s, pork was often the more accessible protein, and the pork version had a depth and richness chicken couldn't quite match. She'd simmer pork ribs or neck bone pieces in a heavy pot with onion, celery, salt, and black pepper for 2 hours until the broth had gone rich and the meat had loosened from the bone. The dumplings were made from flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, lard, and just enough milk to bring the dough together, dropped by the spoonful into the simmering broth where they puffed up into something soft and billowy. The lid went on and stayed on for 15 minutes. You never lifted it during those 15 minutes because the steam was what finished them. She knew. You didn't ask why. When the lid came off, the dumplings were done and supper was what she'd always said it would be. Fried mullet with grits was a supper that told you immediately where someone was from. The Gulf Coast, the Florida Panhandle, the low country of Georgia and South Carolina, because striped mullet was the working person's fish of those regions, caught inshore, sold cheap at dockside markets, and prepared in African-American households with a care that elevated it past what anyone would expect from a fish that cost almost nothing. The mullet were cleaned, scored along the sides to let the seasoning penetrate, dredged in a mixture of cornmeal, salt, and cayenne, then fried in lard, not oil, lard, in a cast iron skillet hot enough to set the crust immediately. The cornmeal sealed the outside into something golden and crackling, while the inside stayed white and mild and flaky. Grits went in a pot early, cooked low and slow until smooth and dense enough to hold the fish laid across the top of the bowl. Hot sauce over everything. That combination, crackling crust, smooth grits, sharp heat, was a supper built from almost nothing that tasted like something specific and irreplaceable. Braised beef short ribs with rice turned the toughest, most overlooked cut at the butcher counter into something so tender it came apart with a spoon. English cut bone-in short ribs, thick slabs of beef still attached to the rib bone, cheap through the 1960s because most people didn't know what to do with them, got seasoned hard, browned on all sides in a heavy pot until the exterior had crusted dark and the fat had rendered into the bottom of the pan. In went sliced onion, a bay leaf, enough water to come halfway up the ribs, lid on low for 2.5 hours until the meat had pulled away from the bone and the braising liquid had reduced into a thick, dark gravy that needed nothing added. Ladled over white rice, with that liquid poured over the plate, it was the kind of supper that made the house smell like Sunday, even on a Wednesday. She hasn't been here in years. The ribs are still at the counter, waiting for someone who knows what they're for. Mustard and turnip greens, cooked together with cornmeal dumplings, was a supper most people have never encountered, even among those who grew up eating greens, because it required knowing two things at once: how to cook a proper pot of mixed greens and exactly when to drop the dumplings into the potlikker without disturbing the greens underneath. She'd cook the mustard and turnip together because the mustard ran sharp and bitter and the turnip ran milder and earthy, and the two balanced each other in a way that neither did alone. When the greens had cooked down and the potlikker had deepened, she'd mix a quick cornmeal dumpling, coarse cornmeal, a little flour, baking powder, salt, enough water to make it just barely spoonable, and drop it by the tablespoon at the edges of the pot where it would steam and set without sinking into the greens. The dumplings pulled the potlikker into themselves as they cooked, becoming dense and flavorful and something entirely their own. That was a full supper, nothing else needed. You either know that or you don't. And if the greens pot fed the body and spirit together, crackling cornbread as a full supper carried something older still. She'd fold the cracklings, coarse, salty, fried bits of rendered pork skin left over after lard was made, directly into the cornmeal batter before it went into the cast iron skillet, where they'd set into the bread and give every bite a richness and chew that plain cornbread could never match. Served in thick wedges alongside a bowl of potlikker from the greens, it was a complete supper. Cornbread sopped the broth, Cracklings gave the fat and the protein, and the Potlikker gave everything else. It cost almost nothing. It tasted like the hands that made it. Those hands are gone now, and nobody has figured out how to put that flavor back into a skillet without them. Fried chicken gizzards and rice required patience twice, once from the cook and once from the gizzards themselves. Soaked overnight in buttermilk to soften the dense muscle tissue, then drained, seasoned, dredged in flour, and fried low and slow in lard. Not the fast hot fry of a chicken thigh, but 15 to 20 minutes on medium low, turning once, because gizzards are dense connective muscle and high heat leaves them rubbery. Done right, the crust was crackling and deep brown, and the interior had gone tender all the way through. Over white rice, with a thin gravy made from the drippings stirred together with a little water. She made it without a clock. She knew exactly when they were done, and she has been gone long enough now that the knowledge went with her. Dried field peas with snaps announced your people the moment you said the name, because snaps, the snap pieces of green bean added to the field pea pot partway through cooking, was not a term that traveled far beyond the deep South Black communities where this dish had been made for generations. Purple hull peas or crowder peas went in first, simmered with a piece of salt pork until they'd softened and the broth had gone starchy and thick. The snaps went in later, green beans broken by hand into inch-long pieces, the audible snap of each break marking the pace of the kitchen, and cooked until tender but still holding together. Served in a bowl with cornbread on the side, the Potlikker soaking into the bread. If you didn't grow up calling green beans snaps, none of this sounds like anything particular. If you did, you already know whose kitchen this was and exactly what it smelled like on a summer evening. Time equals 1 second / greater than ham bone vegetable soup needed nothing except a ham bone, whatever vegetables were on hand, and the understanding that the bone was not an afterthought, it was the entire point. She'd put the bone in first, covered with cold water, brought to a boil, then everything else went in according to what was in the drawer or the garden: potatoes, carrots, celery, canned tomatoes, cabbage, dried beans if she'd soaked them the night before. It simmered all afternoon. By evening, the broth had turned something entirely different from what went in. Dark and rich and deeply savory, every vegetable having absorbed its share of what that bone gave up over hours. She made it look effortless. It was the last soup she ever made, and nobody wrote down what she put in it. Flour gravy over white rice asked nothing of you but honesty. No meat, no vegetables, nothing hidden behind a more presentable name. She'd melt lard in a skillet, whisking flour until the two had cooked together into a pale paste, then pour in water slowly, stirring until the gravy smoothed and thickened. Salt and black pepper. That was everything. Over white rice, hot from the pot, it was a meal that came from the days when there was genuinely nothing else in the house and supper still had to happen. What she made from those 4 ingredients was not a compromise. It was not a lesser version of something better. It was warm, it was filling, it was made with attention and without shame, and the people who grew up eating it know something about dignity that no amount of explaining will ever convey to people who didn't. Braised pigtails over rice arrived at the end of the week when the pantry was bare and payday was still a day away, and it arrived not as a defeat but as quiet alchemy, taking a cut so bony and gelatinous that most people never looked twice at it and turning it into something that made the whole house smell like a celebration. She'd rinse the tails, season them with salt and black pepper, and set them in a heavy pot with just enough water, lid on low for 2 hours until the skin had gone completely soft and the collagen had dissolved out of the joints and turned the braising liquid thick and glossy and dark. That liquid got poured over white rice in the bowl along with the tails, and the rice absorbed it all, every bit of rendered fat and concentrated flavor. She is not here anymore, but the memory of that bowl on a Thursday evening with the week almost done and the house smelling like that doesn't leave. Skillet pork and sweet potatoes was the kind of supper that turned two cheap ingredients into something that looked and tasted deliberate. Pork shoulder pieces or country-style ribs cut into chunks and browned in lard until the edges crisped, then sweet potatoes peeled and diced into the same skillet, cubes small so they'd cook fast, with a splash of water to steam everything through, a lid dropped on, and the heat kept at medium for 12 minutes until the potatoes were fork tender and had soaked up every bit of pork fat in the pan. The combination was older than the skillet itself. West African food traditions paired yams and pork centuries before the American South claimed the combination as its own, and the sweet potato, botanically distinct from the yam but occupying the same cultural space in black kitchens, brought natural sweetness that needed no sugar added. A little hot sauce on the side, maybe a wedge of cornbread if there was time. Done. Chitlin loaf took the tradition of chitlins and transformed them into something convenient for church fellowship tables. After chitlins were thoroughly cleaned and boiled tender, they were chopped fine and mixed with cornmeal, eggs, onions, and seasoning to form a loaf. Baked until firm and sliced thick, it could be served at room temperature, perfect for potluck, tables where dishes needed to hold up. Church mothers who made chitlin loaf were respected for their patience, as preparing chitlins required hours of careful work. The dish appeared at watch night services when traditional foods held deep significance. For many, it represented preserving ancestral food ways and honoring traditions even when shortcuts tempted. Chitlin loaf was heritage shaped into slices, served with pride where memory and faith gathered together. Smothered cube steak was the weeknight miracle that made a cheap, tenderized cut taste like something a family had worked all day to deserve. She dusted each piece in seasoned flour, salt, black pepper, garlic powder pressed in by hand, then laid them into hot oil and didn't touch them until the crust was set, because flipping too early was how you lost the bark she'd spent years getting right. Once browned, she built the gravy in the same skillet, scorched flour bits lifted with water, onion rings laid down flat, everything simmered dark and glossy. The steaks went back in, covered low heat, 30 minutes until they cut with the side of a fork. Cube steak, mechanically tenderized, top round, was sold in black neighborhoods at a fraction of sirloin's price. The gravy did the work the price couldn't. She made this on Wednesdays, always Wednesdays, and the smell met you at the front door before you touched the knob. Nobody makes it on Wednesdays anymore. Nobody makes it at all. Chicken and cornmeal dumplings stretched one bird to feed an entire congregation when times were lean, but faith remained strong. Church mothers simmered a whole chicken until meat fell from bones, creating rich golden broth, fragrant with celery, onion, and bay leaf. Cornmeal dumplings were mixed by hand, combining cornmeal with flour, baking powder, and lard, then dropped by spoonfuls into bubbling broth. As they cooked, dumplings swelled and absorbed the chicken essence, becoming soft pillows floating in savory liquid. The dish was ladled into bowls at homecomings, repasts, and revival week suppers. This represented resourcefulness and community, showing how one chicken could become a feast through skilled hands and generous spirits willing to share whatever they had. Pinto beans with salt pork over white rice was the Monday supper, the wash day meal set on the back of the stove before laundry started and left to simmer all morning. She rinsed the dried pintos the night before and soaked them in cold water until morning. The salt pork went in early, that cured, fatty slab that cost almost nothing and gave the pot everything. Low heat did the rest, breaking the beans down into a thick, creamy broth that absorbed every bit of the pork smoke by the time supper came around. Pinto beans followed black families north during the Great Migration, arriving in Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland kitchens as a comfort that needed no adjustment for the new address. The rice went underneath, plain and white, and the beans went over, and that was enough. You ate until the bowl was clean. She is gone now. Nobody starts the beans the night before anymore. Salmon croquettes were a Friday staple in African-American church kitchens, where canned salmon transformed into golden, crispy patties, feeding the faithful during Lenten seasons. Church mothers mixed salmon with sautéed onions, eggs, cracker crumbs, and seasonings, shaping mixture into oval patties before frying until exterior turned crackling brown. The inside remained moist with salmon's richness enhanced by onion. These croquettes appeared at fish fry fundraisers and Friday night suppers when meat was avoided. Canned salmon was economical yet nutritious, providing protein without requiring fresh fish many communities could not access. Salmon croquettes represented practicality and tradition, their golden crust beloved across generations until convenience foods replaced handmade versions. Salmon croquettes turned a 15-cent can into something that smelled like real cooking. She drained the pink salmon, bones and all, mashing them in because those soft bones weren't going to waste, then folded in diced onion, cracker meal, a beaten egg, and black pepper until it held its shape in her palms. Cast iron hot, each patty dropped in with that flat hiss that meant the temperature was right. You didn't need a thermometer, you knew the sound. In the 1960s, a 14-ounce can of pink salmon cost less than a quarter at corner stores on Chicago's South Side and Detroit's Black Bottom, and it fed 4 people without anyone leaving hungry. The simplest question about this dish today, how do you keep them from falling apart, tells you exactly who learned it by watching and who didn't. Franks and beans was a Tuesday night staple that nobody put on a menu but everybody ate. A package of frankfurters sliced on the diagonal, dropped into a pot of navy beans that had soaked overnight or come out of a can if the week was rough, seasoned with onion, ketchup, mustard, and enough black pepper to make it mean something. The whole thing bubbled together in one pot for 10 minutes while cornbread crisped in the skillet alongside. It wasn't restaurant food, it wasn't church food. It was Monday's paycheck stretched to cover Thursday's table, and in African-American urban households from Chicago's South Side to Harlem's tenements, this combination fed families through the 1950s and 60s without requiring a single apology. You ate it fast and you ate it quiet. Second helpings were not guaranteed. Neckbones and butter beans filled fellowship halls with comfort only slow-cooked food could provide. Church mothers simmered smoked pork neck bones for hours until meat became tender enough to fall apart at the touch of a fork. Butter beans absorbed the smoky, salty essence of pork as they cooked down into creamy softness. The broth turned silky, seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and onion. This dish appeared at Wednesday night suppers and special fellowship gatherings when something hearty was needed. It stretched inexpensive cuts into meals, satisfying both body and spirit, providing complete protein and warmth. Though rarely seen on modern tables, neckbones and butter beans proved that church kitchens could transform scarcity into abundance through faith and patience. Crackling bread is what happened when the hog rendering was done and cracklings were left over. Those curled, salty bits of fried pork skin that came out of the log pot. She folded them straight into the cornbread batter, and what came out was something no plain cornbread could touch. Pork fat worked into every bite, the cracklings making pockets of salt and crunch. The technique traces to the era when hog killing in late fall was a community event. Neighbors working together, nothing wasted, cracklings going directly into that evening's bread. By the 1960s, most urban households had moved past home lard rendering, but cracklings were still sold in paper bags at southern markets, and grandmothers who'd come north on the Great Migration kept the recipe because they knew what plain cornbread was missing. What it was missing was this: the last people who made it right are mostly gone. The loss is not a small one. Stewed tomatoes and okra came together in one cast iron skillet in less time than it took to set the table. Fresh or canned tomatoes went in first with diced onion and a little bacon grease. Then sliced okra, cut thick, never thin, because thin sliced okra disintegrates and the elders knew the difference. Added in the last 8 minutes so it stayed toothsome and didn't turn to mush. Salt, pepper, and a pinch of cayenne. That was it. Served over white rice, this dish had West African ancestry that predated the American South by centuries. Okra arrived in the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, carried by enslaved West Africans who understood it as a staple crop and a natural thickener, and it planted itself in Gula, Creole, and Deep South kitchens where it never left. She didn't need a reason to make it. The okra was in season. That was reason enough. Before the slow cooker arrived to pretend it had invented one-pot cooking, your grandmother was already doing this with a Dutch oven and a gas flame set to medium-low. These suppers fed generations without a single written word. If one of them lives in your memory, let it live in the comments too.